before the beginning of this, presentation, we're talking about, how do you identify kind of the 20 most common trees, that are in Boston. And one of the things that you could use to identify them is just the number of trees that there are. And the city of Boston currently is going through an inventory of the street and park trees that the city owns themselves, but that doesn't take into account any of the privately owned trees that there may be. One of the other things to think about is it the actual volume of the tree that counts as far as what is the most common? So with that, it wouldn't be the number of species or the number of trees that there are, but it actually be the size of the trees. And so some of these trees we'll talk about, may not be the largest trees that we have in the city of Boston, but maybe some of the greatest just in number as far as how many there are. So moving on, well, let's see. There we go. So why are trees so important? So trees, they beautify the landscape that we have, and as well as storing carbon dioxide in their wood. They're also making the oxygen that we breathe, and they intercept water from storms and decrease the amount of storm water that we would have to build infrastructure for, as well as providing food that we eat and make homes for wildlife, the building materials for our homes, as well as providing heating for our homes. One of the projects that our company is involved with is a lot of the trees that we do need to take down. We take the wood that from those trees and it gets trucked up to Maine, where there's a power plant that burns that for biomass. So that's a renewable resource that's helping reduce the amount of petroleum that's being burned, or coal that's being burned to provide energy. Some of the things that a lot of people don't think about when you think about the value that trees provide is that they increase the value of your home. So a smartly landscaped property, the value of that home can actually be increased by anywhere between 5 and 20% based on the trees that are there on the property. As well as planting in the right location can decrease the amount of money that you spend on heating and cooling costs. A lot of clients that I meet with will ask me to remove a tree without thinking about the fact that, oh, now all of a sudden I'm going to be spending more money in order to, heat or cool my home. Or they have me remove a tree in order to put solar panels on their roof, saying, well, that's the only way I can get the amount of energy that I would need from my solar panels, not thinking about the fact that you will now spend more money on air conditioning in order to get those trees, at your property after the trees have been removed. There are some cool tools that you can use. I know that the Davy Tree Expert Company and the U.S. Forest Service did a project called iTree. You can basically take any tree on any property and figure out the value that that tree is providing, both in the amount of water that it's intercepting, but also the amount of sunlight that that's preventing from getting onto your roof, and would tell you whether a tree planted on the north side of a property is actually a detriment to your property, which could be the case if you had an evergreen planted on that side. So some of the other resources that trees are providing is increase the lifespan of roadways and roofs, just the lack of UV light that's getting onto those, as well as decreased crime rates, reduction in recovery time in the hospital, and reduction in speeding. And some of those things that people don't think about have happened through weird science projects that have happened where companies who've done landscaping and at a hospital, and they couldn't finish it. And so on one side of the hospital, there were trees that somebody was looking out at as they were recovering, and on the other side, there wasn't. And they looked at the recovery time from those, and the people who had a view of trees actually recovered quicker. The same as apartment complexes, the same thing where one side of the apartment complex was looking over trees, the other side didn't, and they looked at the crime statistics, and there was less crime committed when people could have a view of a landscape. And again, reduction in speeding is just, as the road looks narrower, as trees get closer to the roadway, people tend to speed less, thinking about there's an object there in the road that they may be impacted by. So not every tree is planted or growing in the right place. So like I said, planting a tree that's right up against the roadway or a sidewalk can be a detriment, can be an issue as far as ADA or other issues with that tree being in that specific location. So when we are thinking about planting trees or advocating for trees to be planted in certain locations, we want to think about what the long-term growth of that tree is and what other resources or things may be impacted by the location of that specific tree. So planting the right tree in the right place. So we look at a park here in downtown Boston. This is Post Office Square, a park that I took care of for many years. This used to be a 4-story tall parking structure that was there. They then demolished that parking structure and built 6 stories underground available for parking. And then we're able to install all of these trees, in that same location. And so it's something that these trees have been in that same location since the early 90s. So, through smart infrastructure, we can actually install trees in a place we would never think that we'd be able to do that before. And that's even the Rose Kennedy Greenway. You can think about another instance of removing above ground infrastructure, moving that underground, and then allowing trees to be planted in the same place. So how do we determine, where that right place to plant a tree is? We want to look at overhead power lines and what the ultimate height of that tree is going to be. I know I've been upset by it in the past when you see the utility company come by and they kind of hack away at the trees that are growing within the power lines. They have an easement within 10 feet of those lines. So we just want to think about, ultimately, is that tree going to be within the area that tree is growing into, as well as the size of the ultimate hole we're going to plant that tree into, and what the current conditions are of the soil. Is it something that I need to amend the soil or reduce compaction? Is there too much salt that's in the soil where I would need to completely remove that in order to plant a tree in that location? As well as one of the biggest things when we're planting new trees is the availability of water. I know the city of Boston, when you are looking to have a tree planted in front of your home, they'll have you, they'll come and talk to you about, are you going to be willing to, come and water this tree? And they'd be more likely to plant a tree in front of your home if you are more willing to go out and water that tree. And that's the number one factor I see as far as tree mortality in the city of Boston, is just the lack of water resources, as well as certain trees don't have, there are certain insects or diseases that we want to be on the lookout for, and just knowing that we have to limit our resources as far as what we would spend on those things over time. There seems to be a lot more money for people to plant trees than there is money for people to take care of trees, unfortunately. And then the last thing would be just future construction or grade changes. So when we plant a tree, just thinking about when, what might happen around that tree over time. And are we better off waiting to plant a tree until the construction is changed or the grade is changed the ultimate way that it will be? So how do we identify trees? So trees are identified by their Latin name, and we use binomial nomenclature. So that means we have both a genus and a species, and we'll talk about that in a minute, what that exactly means. So this tree that we have here on the right, some people will call this tree a red maple. Other people will call it a Norway maple, or a crimson king maple, or a crimson maple. But how do we know exactly which tree we're talking about? So when a client calls me on the phone and they say, hey, I need you to come look at the red maple on my property, they might be talking about this tree. And if it's in the wintertime and there's no leaves on that tree, how would I identify that this is that specific tree? So this is why we use the Latin name for a tree. So each tree has 2 names, the genus and the species. So the genus name is like your kind of last name or your family name that you have. So it might be like Smith or Potter. So in this instance, this would be Acer is the genus, and then the species would be like your first name. So it's either John or Sarah. So for example, my last name is Holman, so my genus would be Holman, but my first name would be Russell. That's how you would know the difference between talking about me versus one of my 2 other brothers. So, for this tree, we're looking at, an Acer is the genus, and then the species is Platinoides, and then the specific epithet, because this is a specific variety of that tree, is Crimson King. So the full name for this tree would be Acer Platinoides, Crimson King is how we would identify this tree. When we're looking at trees, one of the biggest differences are going to be the deciduous tree, this tree on the right, ones that lose their leaves, versus the evergreen tree, the one on the left. So those are ones that hold on to their leaves or needles all year round. Deciduous trees are known for losing their leaves. That would be your oaks, maples, lindens, beech trees. There's a lot of, probably most common trees you're thinking about are those trees that are losing their leaves. Evergreen trees are known for keeping their needles. Those are going to be your pine or spruce or fir. A lot of times I meet with clients and they call everything that holds on to their needles a pine tree. And so there has to be a little bit of education that happens around that, especially when you have to, talk between different groups and as far as identifying the tree and understanding that we're all talking about the specific same tree. Common evergreen trees, the most common that you're going to see in the city of Boston are going to be the eastern white pine, the western arborvitae, and the American arborvitae, and we'll go into those here. So the eastern white pine, this is the tree that's our kind of mascot for ArborWeek tree care. So it has a near and dear place in my heart as far as this is the tree that we identify with. It's known as Pinus Strobis. It can grow to 178 feet tall. That's the largest one here in Massachusetts, is out in North Adams. It's surrounded by a number of other eastern white pines that are all of similar size. And that's the reason why that tree has grown to be as big as it is. They're some of the oldest trees in New England. If we went back about 1,500 years, this is probably the only tree that you would see here in New England would be these eastern white pines, and Canadian hemlocks would be the only trees that we see. One of the ways I identify this tree from the other pine trees that you have around is this is a 5-needled evergreen tree. And those needles are going to be fairly long. You are going to have a lot of sap on those trees, as well as them growing very quickly at 24 to 36 inches. And that 5-needled part of the tree, the way I remember it is, white has 5 letters. There's 5 needles on that white pine tree. That's one of the things I use to help myself remember that white pine tree. So looking at, that needle that you can see there on the left, it's something that it's a white needle. We have a kind of a silvery grayish bark that's there in the middle there, as well as you can see they can grow many different ways from that first one we saw in the first picture to this kind of more openly grown one, in the middle of a field where there aren't as many branches in the middle. One of the other common trees that we're going to talk about are these Arborvitae. So there's this western Arborvitae is one of the non-native species we have. It's also known as Pacific cedar or giant cedar. Its Latin name is that Thuja plicata. It's a very common hedge planting that we see. The needles are very short, but it's also soft. One of the reasons why I recommend this tree is because of the single stem that you can see. They grow very tall. The most common one you can see here on the left is going to be that green giant Arborvitae that you see. It's something that you can buy these at Lowe's or Home Depot. They're tend not to be a very expensive plant because they do grow very quickly. They tend not to have too many insect or disease issues, but they also tend not to be one of the more outstanding plants in somebody's landscape. They're kind of the white rice of plants. They just kind of are in the background. So one of the other, Arborvitae that we have is this American Arborvitae, and this is the one that is native to here in New England, in these northern climates. It's known as white cedar or eastern white cedar. A lot of people will find both the Thuja occidentalis and this, the western Arborvitae, the Thuja plicata. They'll say, they're almost interchangeable. But if you kind of grab the hedge itself and you pull those apart, these kind of banana peel apart. And this is why in the winter, you'll see the ice and wind kind of pull these plants apart. Again, very common as a hedge planting. These needles are going to be very short and soft. They tend almost always to be multi-trunked, and they're a lot more open than those western Arborvitaes are. So when you look at these, you'll see they'll be a lot wider than those are. They tend to be a little more dense as far as the way they grow, but you'll see the multi-stem is one of the biggest things I use to identify these. So again, you can see the needles on these, in comparison to that western Arborvitae are going to be a lot more open. They tend to have these bigger seed pods that you can see on them, which are those yellow flowers you see in the middle there. And you can see this one on the right looks like it's single stem, but if you did pull on that, you would see multi-stem there. So we have a long list of these deciduous trees. We'll get into to these as many as we can in the next, kind of 30 minutes that we have here. And I'm going to group them by the different trees. So we'll go for the maples first with those. So most common are going to be the maples. So all maples are in that Acer genus. It's something that their branches are always opposite from each other. So if you're looking to identify a maple from an oak, when you look at the buds where those come out from the actual branch itself, they're going to be opposite from each other. So there'll be 2 buds on either side of a stem from each other. And there are not many plants that tend to do that. It's something that it can be a good way of identifying if something's a maple or not. The fruit of this tree is going to be that wing samara. So that's kind of the winglet that you see fly down from those trees. So this Freeman Maple, Acer Freemanii, is a hybrid species. It's a hybrid of both a red and silver maple. So it kind of has the best and worst of both worlds. They genetically crossed those two trees together. That's what that X in the Latin name means, is it's a horticultural cross, but it's a very fast growing species, and which is why it's a very commonly planted tree in the city of Boston, just for its speed of growth. It'll grow to be somewhere between 40 and 60 feet tall by about 20 and 40 feet wide. Both the red and silver maple are tolerant of wetland conditions, which means they will tolerate the compaction that you get in a city environment. They'll tolerate a lot of the salt that you get in a city environment well, which is another reason why they're a very commonly planted tree. You can see on the leaves of this Freeman maple that is very pointy at the end. It can be hard to identify this in comparison to even a red or sugar maple if you don't know what you're looking at. One of the things I look at with these are where that leaf, that petiole is the stem where the leaf attaches to the twig. You can see where that curve is on the bottom of that. And that can be one of the ways that you identify this. But the pointiness of those leaves is something that's also another good identifier as far as what this tree looks in comparison to even sugar maple. So another one of the dreaded common maples that we have, here in Massachusetts is the Norway maple, the Acer Platinoides. We talked a little bit about this earlier. So even those Crimson King maple that we looked at, or Crimson Queen is another one that we see often, these Acer Platinoides. These maples are the only ones that produce latex. So when you pull off those buds or you pull off a leaf and you squeeze that petiole, you squeeze the end of that stem, you can get a little bit of a white sap that comes out of that, and that's latex. It's the only maple tree that we have here that actually produces that. It's a natural defense mechanism that tree produces, and all year round, whether it's summer, spring, winter, fall, you can pull off a leaf or a bud and squeeze it and get that little bit of white sap that comes out. It's sticky between your fingers, and know that that is a Norway maple. These are considered invasive because of how prolific those trees, go into the environment. It's something that each one of those samara, those seeds, when they fall off, what happens is they produce another Norway maple. They're about 80% viable. That means that 80% of those seeds actually will grow out in the environment, in comparison to a Japanese maple that you might have on your property, where that Japanese maple maybe is 10%, which is why, even though they're both non-native trees to this area, it is something that it is considered an invasive species. They are very fast growing. They do have a tendency to be very weak wooded. A faster growing tree is going to not be as strong as a slower growing tree. And they also tend not to compartmentalize decay internally as well. Doesn't mean that they're a tree you should get rid of everywhere. They are providing some benefits. If the only tree you have in front of your house is a Norway maple, then it's something that's better than having no tree in front of your house. And that was my situation when I lived in Roslindale. The only tree I had in front of my house was a Norway maple, although it had a disease on it. It was something that I kept that tree around, despite talking with the city about it over the years, because it was the only tree I had. And if they removed it, I would not be able to have a tree in the future because of ADA and other issues. Looking at the tree, you can see the difference in the way that leaf kind of comes in, that way that kind of curves up and into the petiole comes into the leaf itself. As they grow out, you can see that kind of lime green foliage as they're trying to pull so much more of that, nutrients out of the ground more than any other tree. It makes these very striking as they grow to identify them from either sugar maple or red maple. So red maple, the way I identify this tree is you look at the leaf here, you can see there's 3 points on that, R-E-D, red, that helps identify that red maple. Again, part of that Acer family. Acer rubrum is the Latin name for this tree. It is native to Massachusetts. It's a very fast growing tree that also likes the swampy areas, as we talked about with a Freeman maple. Growing anywhere between 40 and 80 feet tall by 50 to 60 feet wide. Probably the most common variety I see planted is that October Glory, planted mostly for its fall color. It has a beautiful orange fall color on it, which is part of the reason why people like this tree. You can see, here we have that beautiful red foliage that you have there in the fall on that tree, as well as on the right here, you can see the 3-pointed leaf on that tree as well, is how we can identify that red maple. So moving away from the maples, unfortunately, I had to cut out a few because they're not as common, but moving on from those to the ash trees. So all ash trees are in this Fraxinus family. They're native to Massachusetts, or at least some of them are native here to the state. They're one of the last trees to leaf out in the spring. I get a lot of calls late in the spring, in May, people saying, I think my ash tree is dead. And it's not dead, it'll leaf out, but it's also one of the first trees to drop its leaves in the fall. This is a very common tree for people to produce baseball bats from. So it does have a good, economic use. It gets its name from firewood. It's something that it produces very little ash when it burns. It has a high BTU count, so it's something that it produces a lot of heat without a lot of ash, which is how it gets its name. Another one of the trees that has the opposite leaves on it, and it has a compound leaf. So what that means is it looks like there's only one, this long stem that comes out, and there'll be many leaflets, they call it, on this nice long stem that you have. And all these little leaflets that are on there are making it so that way, they're part of a leaf, that whole long stem that comes out from the bud. And that's the difference between a compound and a simple leaf. So the most common one that we have in Boston is this green ash tree. It's the Fraxinus pennsylvanica. You can kind of get an idea from the Latin name, Pennsylvanica. Oh, this is a plant that was native to Pennsylvania, or at least around that area, and that's how it got its name. These trees are susceptible to emerald ash borer. It's something that if you look at the Midwest, it's something they lost most of their ash trees from that insect. It's something that I've been doing some work with the city of Boston as far as trying to protect the ash trees that they have. But the USDA is saying without treatment, we probably will end up losing most of our native ash trees, if we don't do something about treating them for this emerald ash borer. One of the reasons why they are planted very commonly is because of their tolerance of city conditions, meaning they tolerate salt and they tolerate being in compaction in just poor environments, and will continue to grow in those environments. So you can see here on the left, that's a compound leaf that we talked about. So something that leaf, coming out of the stem, there's the, 7 leaflets that you have coming off of that green ash tree there. The trunk of this tree here, you can see there's kind of those fissures, those lines that you can see on the trunk as it gets older. Here on the right, tends to be a little smoother with a younger tree. We'll get confused sometimes with another species that isn't native. It can get confused with the tree of heaven on occasion between those two trees, but there tends not to be the smell that you get from the tree of heaven with this green ash tree that we have here. So moving on, we have the ginkgo. Ginkgo is one of my favorite trees. It's the oldest living deciduous tree that we have in the world today. It also has a number of medicinal uses. People will actually take pills of ginkgo. It's thought to help increase blood flow, so it's good for memory. One of the things I love about this tree is that from the time that it starts to drop its leaves until all the leaves fall off is 24 hours. So from a cleanup standpoint, if a client had issues with oak trees in the past, ginkgo is a great tree to recommend to them, especially knowing that it's kind of a living dinosaur that we have in our world today. Very tolerant of the urban environment, very tolerant of soil compaction, salt, all the other things that you can kind of throw at it. They can't take abuse to, forever, but they can grow through a lot of those things without issue. It is something that there are both male and female versions of this tree. I would not recommend planting a female version of this tree only because, I guess unless you hate your neighbor, that might be a reason why you would plant a female version of this tree. But the females produce a fruit, and the fruit, as it falls, it smells kind of like dog vomit on the ground. And so when you go to buy a ginkgo, if you buy a named variety of that, Autumn Sunset, or Maidenhair, there's a number of varieties of these ginkgo. You'll know that there will be a specific clone. It will be the exact same. So each one that you get, whether you plant it here in New York City or down, in Tennessee, you're going to get the exact same tree from that. The only issue with planting a clone is that if there was one specific thing that came across, it would kill every one of that specific variety. We haven't had any issues with the ginkgo so far, but as they become more and more common, it is something to keep a lookout for. So these ginkgo tree, they kind of look just different than anything else that we see in the environment. If you think about, maybe 2,000 years ago, what this tree might have looked like. It's just fascinating to think, or even 2 million years ago, what this tree would have looked like, with the dinosaurs. These are just living fossils that we have. And this beautiful yellow foliage that you get in the fall is one of the reasons people like to plant this tree. It's they can be a lot more open, where you can see on the right, this one tends to be a little more compact or more well-rounded, but it's something that, depending on the variety that you can get a lot more open of a tree. And one thing, if you're trying to grow this from a seed and you don't know if you have a male or female, it takes 15 years for it to actually produce a fruit. So tends to be, by the time people have figured out whether they have a male or female tree, it might be too late. You're kind of stuck with whichever one that you have on the property. So the honey locust, Gleditsia tricanthos, the one I see most commonly is the thornless version of that tree. It's native to Pennsylvania. They can grow to be 120 feet tall. The non-thornless version of this tree produces a very nasty thorn. The thorn is big. It's a 3-inch thorn. And as somebody who climbs trees, it's something that it cannot be fun to climb around a tree with those big thorns in the tree. But this was a tree that was planted for a number of years because of these small leaflets that you can see on it. If you look here on the right-hand side, you can see, these small little leaflets that come out, and when they drop off the tree, it makes it pretty easy to clean up in comparison to some of the other trees that have the larger leaves, like an oak or a maple. If you had to rake these up, this blows off of a property fairly easily. And because for a number of years they didn't have any insect or any disease issues, they were almost overplanted to a point. Now we tend to see a number of different insect and disease issues, from a podgall midge that they get on them that causes those leaves to fall off early, to spider mites, which can cause some of the yellowing that you're seeing on the left. So it's something that, it's a little overplanted at this point, but still a valuable tree to have in our built environment. Another tree here is the sweet gum. So this is liquid ambar Styractiflua, one of my favorite trees as far as the Latin name to say it. It produces these gumballs. A friend of mine who lives in Pennsylvania was taking care of the champion tree. That means that's the largest one in the state. So he was taking care of the champion sweet gum tree in Pennsylvania, and it was on a private property. That one sweet gum tree produced 26 yards of gumballs per year. And ultimately, the homeowner decided to take that tree down just because of the sheer number of gumballs that was falling out of this tree. Again, in a city environment, it can be a great tree. It's just something to think about where we plant that tree, ultimately based on the fact that this tree is going to produce these gumballs that are going to be a concern, in the future. It is native to the Southwest. It's something that, some of the other gum trees that they have down in the South, this is similar to those, will tolerate the soil compaction, will tolerate, sitting in water, will tolerate drought, no problem, because it kind of grew up in those environments. Very uniform, straight, upright tree. We tend not to have to do a whole lot of pruning on these trees because they grow with one nice, strong central leader on these trees. So, if you're looking to plant a tree and not have to do too much pruning on it, if you plant it, in the right location, this can be a great tree to plant at your property, and not have to worry about insect or disease issues too much on that, as well as, too much pruning to have on these trees. Moving on to the crabapple. So the Malus family is also the same as the apple family. So both crabapple and apple are very closely related. The Latin name for this being Malus species, SPP, just means that there's so many of these different crab apples. We kind of group them all into one together. It is a native tree. When you think about that Johnny Appleseed and what he was doing, probably most of the trees he was actually planting were not actual apple trees. He was actually more interested in growing apple trees for making hard cider. So a lot of that hard cider was made from these crab apples, and they won't be the small little ones we see most often on people's properties, which are kind of that, smaller than a marble size. these crab apples that Johnny Appleseed was producing would be decent sized fruit. It would be a 2.5, 3 inch diameter fruit that he was producing. They're all part of that rose family. So anytime you think about the issues that roses have, from having Japanese beetles to having mites to any one of the black spot, tar spot diseases that they get on them, these crab apples can have them. It is something that we get a lot of new varieties that are produced every year. The new varieties that are produced every year tend to have a lot more disease and insect tolerance that are bred into them. Most of that comes from the rootstock that they're actually grafted onto, gives us most of that disease resistance on those trees. So looking at the crabapple, one of the things that we look at, to identify this from, a cherry that you would see blooming at a similar time, is going to be looking at the leaves themselves. So once you see those leaves come out, they're going to be, instead of that more ovate shape that you see, they're going to be a lot more rounded shape that you see. And then, the tend to be more of a pinkish tinge on the cherries that we see planted in comparison to the crab apples, although you can get the flowers in almost any color that you would want on these crab apples as well. So one of the most dreaded trees I have in the landscape that I see planted very often is the Callery pear or Bradford pear, Pyrus species. It is considered an invasive species. If you drive around now, you'll see all of these white flowering trees. And once, I've said this to you, you almost wish I never said it, but they do kind of smell like rotting fish. I used to go around and I was treating trees for winter moth years ago. And it was like, oh, what's that smell? It smells like somebody left their trash out. And that's actually the smell of these pear trees. And that's how they're attracting insects to pollinate the flowers on these trees. They were, bred horticulturally to be this upright gumball shape without needing much pruning. But the average lifespan, in the city of Boston is very short. I was told at one point it was about 7 years, and that's because of the ice and snow damage. Because of that upright forming structure of these trees, they tend to break very quickly from that very weak branching that they have on them. Kind of a marble-sized fruit that's produced on them. You can see that on the left here. Very waxy leaf that's on there. It's very unique to almost any other tree. There is one of these that's planted in Post Office Square. Through proper pruning, you can keep a tree like this around for a long time. But it is something that those, little pears that are produced on that tree does make it so that way birds eat that, they poop that out in the woods, they move that around, and that's where we have, a lot more of these pear trees around than anybody would kind of hope. Because they grow so quickly, this is why a lot of people do plant these, is because they tend to be a very inexpensive tree. So you'll have a lot of home builders who end up installing these pear trees to get that instant color on their property and not have to worry about that too much. Moving on from there, we have the London plane tree. So it's Sycamore X acerifolia. So that means, again, like I said, that X means it's a horticultural cross, that London plane tree. So it's a cross between the American sycamore and an oriental sycamore. And one of the things, if you're familiar with a sycamore tree, if you drive down Memorial Drive in Cambridge, you can see those big, huge sycamore trees that have been there forever. Probably when they first built Memorial Drive, that's when they first planted those trees. These American sycamore or these London plane trees are a cross between those. And one of the reasons they created these is because those American sycamore tend to get a foliar disease on them that causes the leaves to drop prematurely, and that's called anthracnose. These London plane trees are susceptible to it, but they tend not to lose their leaves nearly as quickly. Exclamation is the one that I see planted most commonly. It tends to have one nice strong central stem on it. They will grow to be 75 feet tall by about 75 feet wide, and it is a fairly fast growing tree. They are tolerant of poor soils and city conditions, but one of the things that we're learning about this tree is that over time, this tree can actually increase the VOCs, those volatile organic compounds in the air. So this is one of the trees that actually can make the air quality worse in a city as we're planting more and more of these. And it can be a particular hazard to people who are taking down these trees, that it almost produce like a cotton as we're chipping up these trees that can get stuck in your lung. And it's something that, the day after you take down one of these London plane trees, you'll kind of develop this cough that you wonder, oh, where is it coming from? It's almost this cotton that gets stuck in your lung from these trees. So you can see the bark on these trees. One of the reasons people plant this is you can see that beautiful exfoliating bark that's on this tree, that kind of camouflage color that comes on there. It's just beautifully striking all year round to see them on that. You can see the leaves that are on there. They almost look like maples, but those leaves are a lot bigger than what you would see on either a Norway maple, but not quite as big as what you'll see on a sycamore tree. They do produce, these sycamore balls that are in the tree, and as those kind of explode, those are spreading those seeds around. It's not considered invasive, this tree, but it is something to think about, that there is another liability with these seed pods that are going to be spread throughout the environment. So moving on to the linden trees. So, American basswood, is Tilia americana. The leaves are larger than the little leaf linden. So they, if you're comparing the two trees and wondering which one is which, I'll also show you the difference in the bark between these two trees. But the trees are known to attract many bees. And this is part of the reason why, there's almost like a heavenly view of these linden trees, is because, they were planted in cemetery because of their, attracting wildlife and kind of providing food for wildlife kind of all year round. They're known for having this very upright, uniform shape, kind of pyramidal shape is one of the reasons why people plant these trees. It's a very uniform branching structure, requiring almost no pruning to maintain the kind of size and shape that they are, but they do create kind of a dense amount of shade underneath them from that. So we did talk about, this Tilia family being native to Massachusetts, being around the cemeteries and grown for that uniform shape. So looking at the American basswood, the Tilia americana, you can see there on the left, there are those seeds that are produced on there, that kind of heart-shaped leaf that you have on these American basswood. The bark on these tends to be a lot smoother than the Tilia cordata, than the little leaf linden that we'll talk about in a minute. But they do have all of these flowers that are on them, that you'll also see on the little leaf linden as well. So little leaf linden, Tilia cordata, is smaller. The leaves are smaller than those basswood. They will grow to be about 50 feet wide, 50 feet tall. So they tend to be a little bit smaller than the American basswood. Again, it attracts bees. They're tolerant of those urban conditions. They'll tolerate having soil compaction. I tend to see these planted in parking lots very often. I think it's, for whatever reason, Target tends to be a parking lot. I tend to see these planted a lot around. So the leaf on this, you can see, how much more textured the bark is on this. So it's just a lot more rougher bark that you have on there. Just like the name says, that little leaf, the leaves are, maybe half the size of what you see on that American basswood. It is something that the flowers on these do make it, a very important tree for pollinators, but it also is something to think about for use as far as pesticides go. These trees tend to have an issue with, aphids can get onto these trees and cause the leaves to turn black and maybe fall prematurely, as well as other insects that can cause that kind of sap to fall out of these trees, that people then find on their cars and say, well, I need to treat the tree. We are careful as far as what we're applying, when we're applying it. I would never recommend using, a systemic product on these trees because of that. There's actually been a number of bee kills that have been identified from people applying those products on these Tilia species. And so it's something that it's very important to read the label of whatever product you're using and making sure you're not applying that, especially when these trees are in flower. Moving on to the oak family. So everything in the oak family is this Quercus. They're some of the strongest, longest living deciduous trees we have here in Massachusetts. The wood is very heavy. They're one of the heaviest woods I've had to move around. They are alternate in the way they leaf out. So unlike the maples, unlike those ash trees, they're going to be alternate. The same as the lindens, they're going to be another alternate leafing tree. They are producing acorns, so that acorn is going to be food for wildlife as well as habitat for wildlife. So, among the oak trees, there's kind of two different types. There's the white oaks and the red oaks. So we're going to talk about both this white oak here and a swamp white oak in a minute, as well as a red oak. But the red oak also falls into there's a bur oak and a black oak that we won't talk about today. But they can, if you can get close on them as far as being able to identify them, this is where the kind of separation between the two oaks that we have here is either the red oak type or the white oak type. So Quercus Alba is going to be the white oak. They're a native tree growing, 80 feet tall, 80 feet wide. They can grow very wide. They're very dense. White oak is one of the heaviest, densest woods that we have here in Massachusetts. The leaves are going to be rounded. You can see that in this picture here. So the tips of these are blunt, which is how I can identify this tree most commonly. As you can see that more blunt tip that you have on the leaf in comparison to the red oak that we'll see. It's a very sharp edge that's on there, as well as the bark that pulls off of this tree. That you can see that exfoliating bark, the bark that's peeling off of there, it tends to be a lighter color than what you're going to see on the red oak side of the family. Quercus bicolor is that swamp white oak. It is a native tree. The leaves are going to be rounded on that. It will grow in wet areas. It's why it's named swamp white oak, is because that's conditions it kind of grows in. The bark tends to be a little redder in color than the white oak itself. Grow 60 feet tall, 60 feet wide. You can see the leaves on here almost resemble more of what the English oak, which is another one of the in that white oak family, but the leaves look very different in comparison. But you can see that bark in the middle is a lot more reddish in color than what you'd see out of a white oak itself. And these tend to be a little bit more rare as far as when I'm walking around the people's properties. I don't see the swamp white oak as often as I'm seeing the white oaks. The one other thing is the acorns looks different on these two trees. You can see the cap of the acorn is a little bit wider, and the tip of the acorn is a little bit blunter on the end of that as well. Quercus rubra, so this is red oak. It's a native tree. The leaves have those sharp edges like we talked about before. They can grow 75 feet tall, 75 feet wide. I've seen a number of species that exceed both those numbers. They can tolerate the drought of city conditions, but they don't tolerate it quite as well as what you'd see out of that swamp white oak. So if you did have a street tree that you were looking to plant in front of your property and you just knew it was something that it's going to get salt and sand and all the other dogs coming over to it, I might recommend that swamp white oak over planting one of these red oak trees. So you can see there on the left the sharp tips of those leaves, as well as that deeper, darker color of that red oak tree. You can see that a lot more rounded, that acorn. The cap is a lot shorter on the acorn itself on that tree. So we have two left here. So elm tree, one that's near and dear to my heart. It's something that American elm tree, if we went back, before 1950, this would have been almost every street that we drove down. We would have seen American elm trees. You can see the one here on the right is a very wide spreading tree. This kind of cathedral feeling that people would have driving down the street is one of the reasons why people planted this tree very often. It's something that they are susceptible to Dutch elm disease. Each elm tree has a 1 in 10 chance every single year of getting that disease on it. You can inject the trees with a fungicide that helps prevent that disease, but the disease is actually spread by an insect. So the insect is carrying that fungus on its back. One of the reasons why these elm trees are susceptible is they only produce one set of vascular tissue per year, which means that they use one set, and when they're done with it, that's it. They kind of let that tissue go. And so that Dutch elm disease, when it clogs up that vascular tissue, it's something that it doesn't take long for that tree to actually die. So from the time a tree becomes infected with the inoculum from that Dutch elm disease to when the tree dies can be as short as 6 weeks. Because the time that it spreads around is really in that July-August period, which is when the trees tend to be under stress anyway. Although these will tolerate the drought and city conditions, something that they do best when they're in a wet condition. These elm trees like to grow in wet soil conditions, but they'll tolerate being in drought as well. So you can see the leaf here on the left, again, another opposite leafing tree with that kind of serrated leaf that you have on there. The one that we have in the middle here is, one of those named cultivars that they have. They've been trying to do a lot of breeding programs finding trees that were at different universities or in different locations that, didn't have the issues as far as having the Dutch elm disease on it, and they cloned those trees. They said, well, you're the one survivor that made it amongst all the other elm trees here on campus. One of the most common ones being planted is called Princeton. And it's something that there was one tree at Princeton University that didn't have Dutch elm disease. So they cloned that tree. That's one of the trees we see planted often. That doesn't mean it won't get Dutch elm disease, but it just means it's more resistant. You can see here on the right, that nice cathedral look as you drove down the street of those elm trees. So, some of the trees we spoke about previously is part of the reason why, you see those. So that's one of the reasons why we see Norway maples planted very often, is that was looked at as a fast replacement for these American elm trees. They took these down, in the 70s, in 80s, and as they were getting Dutch elm disease. And then they said, we need something to plant real quick to kind of fill this in. And that's where Norway maple got planted. And now we have all the issues from that. Another tree that was planted, and it is done a lot better as far as, a replacement for, the American elm tree, is this Zelkova serrata, the Japanese Zelkova. It'll grow 80 feet tall, 80 feet wide. It's a good replacement for that elm. If you look at the structure of that, the upright vase structure of that tree is one of the reasons why people like this tree. That upright habit, it tends not to have the disease or insect issues on it. One of the things that I end up seeing on these trees are deadwood production. This tree almost produces deadwood like it's a fruit on the tree. There's a lot of deadwood, and it's just because the tree is so dense at the top of it that the interior branches start to die out. So it's something that pruning does become an issue with this tree, that it does need more regular pruning than what you would see on other species. But this is a tree that we've been planting as a replacement for that. So you can see the serrated leaves that are on this tree. That upright structure that's on it is one of the reasons why we have these Japanese Zelkova. So that's my last slide. I know we only have a few minutes left here. I'm sorry I had to rush through so many of these, but open it up to any questions that there might be.
Thanks so much, Russell. There's a few questions from the chat, so let's get through them. The first one is, can you talk a little bit about white pine disease? Is that a problem that you've seen?
Yeah, so there's a lot of research going on at UMass. So Nick Berzee is the one who's running the diagnostic lab at UMass, and it's something that they've kind of banded together. The people at UMass, UNH, University of Maine, looking at some of the different issues that they've seen on the white pines that kind of seem to come on all of a sudden. Some of the issues related to that, it's more complex than just one disease. It tends to be a few different things that are going on with the tree, including drought, but there's also some scale insects that are causing the white pine trees to not be doing well. So it's a fairly complex thing that unfortunately I know we don't have time to go into, but it's something, if you looked up Nick Berzee in white pine, you'll see a lot of the research he's doing on that. He's published online.
Awesome, thanks. Another question. Any tree suggestions for between Norway maples, 20 to 30 feet away from trunks, ? Coping with shade, root and soil troubles?
Yeah, so Norway maple is one of the species like black walnut, where it actually produces a chemical in the soil that inhibits the growth of other trees around it. So it makes it a really tough place to start to grow a tree because it will inhibit the growth of other trees around those. I would look at some of the understory trees. If you're trying to grow something that's going to outcompete the Norway maples, you almost have no chance of trying to grow something to outcompete those two Norway maples. But it's something that if you did some pruning, you could kind of open it up and then plant something, you might have a chance. But if you wanted to do like a redbud or a dogwood, something that was going to stay understory, grow natively, naturally underneath other trees in a forest, that might be a recommendation for there.
Thank you. What is the best way to protect your tree from salt?
Yeah, so gypsum is one of the best things. It's a type of clay that you can get. So if you do an application of gypsum, just follow the instructions on the bag, but you do an application before you get into winter. So in November, you apply it. I forget exactly what the rate is, but again, read the bag for the instructions on that. You would do that again, first thing in November before, the salt would come from the trucks and all that. And then again in the spring and March, as well as flushing that out with plenty of water. But that gypsum will actually capture the salt that is coming from the road trucks and pull that through the soil and just water, water, water.
Sounds great. Are you still planting ash trees in spite of emerald ash borer?
I personally am not planting or recommending people plant ash trees. Another tree I'm not recommending planting would be Colorado blue spruce. That's another tree that just because of the issues that it's having from a fungal and disease issue, I just say it's not worth planting for most people. But it's something that if you are kind of have the money and have the tolerance for kind of 5 years worth of treatment for the tree, then it'd be something to consider. But it's a conversation to have with a specific tree owner at that point. But I personally don't recommend it.
What is the green lichen type substance you see on many trees? Does that mean the tree is sick or dying?
Yeah, so the lichen that you see on there is a type of moss that's on the tree. It's an indicator of good air quality. So lichen won't grow in a situation in which the air quality is bad. You're going to have lichen growing on a tree anytime that there's not enough sunlight that's getting to the tree, as well as if the tree is not vigorously growing. It's something that I used to take care of a property down in Merriam that was near the ocean, and they had a lot of that moss that was growing on the tree, and it was just the sheer amount of salt that was near the tree cause the trees just not to grow as quickly as they could. And if the tree grows very quickly, the lichen can never really establish itself. So it's not necessarily an indicator that there's something bad. But if you do have lichen, it might not be the worst idea to have an arborist just come out and take a look at a tree and see if there's other things that might benefit the tree in help increase its growth rate.
How far from a house foundation would you plant a tree, with birch as an example?
Yeah, so if you were talking about like a white birch in comparison to like even a river birch, it's something that like a river birch, I would say, probably want to plant that thing at least 20 feet away from your house. White birch, trees won't exploit a crack. Trees won't create a crack in your foundation because they hit a hard substance. They're gonna hit the foundation of your house and they're gonna turn left or right 90 degrees off of that. So it's something you can plant fairly close, but personally, I like to see at least the branching of a tree have a good 10 feet of separation from the roof, so that way squirrels, chipmunks, raccoons can't kind of jump from the tree and then get into your house or building. So it's something that the further away you can plant it, the better. But think about long term. Like I said, the ultimate growth size of the tree, ultimate size that you want to have the tree be, that's a good indicator of how far away you want to have that tree be.
So Russell, I'm going to hop in here with a image that one of our friends sent us about a tree she's been watering in front of her home. There's one photo of it, and I'll share with you another. And I'm wondering if I have my guess on what it is, one of two. But hold on, let me see if I can show you. There's one, and let me get the other up. Here we go. And here's the same tree again.
Yeah, so based on the picture, that looks like an elm tree to me.
That's what I was going to say, either elm or cherry, but I was leaning towards elm.
Yeah, so just based on you can see on this tree, it almost looks like there's little. It's hard to tell just because of the picture itself. And I can if I can share my screen again, we can advance to my email address. If you send me a picture of it directly or your address, I don't mind swinging by and we can at least take a look at the tree. But you can see kind of the seed pods that are hanging down from the tree. You won't see those on a cherry right now. So those seed pods would be the indicator to me that that's an elm tree.
Well, I wanted to thank you before everyone leaves. We have a brief, first of all, a big thank you to Russell. Thank you for joining us and sharing so much about trees. And I'm putting a poll out. So if you take a moment to just answer those 5 questions. And as you do that, I'm going to drop in here. Russell reminded me that we, for the past 3 years, I've been doing volunteer tree inventory in Boston. And now that the city is undertaking its own inventory, we're stepping away from that a little bit, but that doesn't mean we are getting rid of the program, and it certainly doesn't mean that we have forgotten about all the resources we have. So I just dropped a link in there, and if you go to the middle of that page, there's a really great PDF. Oops, did I just dropped in the wrong link? I'm sorry. There's a PDF in there where you can actually see some of the trees that Russell was talking about. close up, and you can learn yourself how to identify a tree using the skills from Russell, using our inventory tree ID guide. And then we also have a 7-part series online. They'll sort of walk you through some tree ID stuff. We pivoted all virtual last year. So thank you so much. I don't know, Russell, if you have a couple of minutes to stay on to answer some lingering questions.
Sure, yeah, I can stick around for another 10-15 minutes and answer some questions.
And again, pop on our webpage. We have events all week. Hope to see you virtually or in person sometime this week to celebrate ArborWeek.
Shall we launch the poll and then get into any last minute questions?
The poll is launched. You just can't see it because you're, yeah.
I see, it's not for me. Well, people are answering the poll. Whoever asked about the Norway maples wanted clarification. What were those understory trees?
Yeah, so I recommended, either doing a dogwood or doing, redbud tree. Those would be, 2 of the understory trees I would take a look at. They just normally would grow underneath, other trees in the forest. So that would be the 2 at least come to mind right now.
And the redbud I know is native. I don't know about the dogwood.
Yeah, so there are native dogwoods. So the Cornus Florida is going to be the native dogwood that we have here. You also have the Cornus Cusa is the non-native tree. There are now hybrids of the 2 of them. The issue with the Cornus Florida is that they can get anthracnose on them. I know I have a number of, the native dogwoods at my property. I don't treat for the anthracnose at my house, but it's something that, if you want to have a perfectly clean, pristine tree, or if the trees had, stress in the past, it is something that I would recommend, having them treated for that anthracnose disease, or planting one of those, varieties that tend not to get the issue.
We have another new question. I have a woodpecker hanging out in my honey locust. Should I be worried about the insects attracting him there?
So the woodpecker is only going to be going after, it depends on the woodpecker, but it's something, the woodpecker itself is going to be going after insects that are already there in the tree, so you can't really help too much about that. There is a woodpecker called the yellow belly sapsucker, and that tends to be the insect. One of my slides you could see on the American basswood, there was kind of the lines that were going straight across, right in a row. And it's something that it's not really going to be doing too much damage to the tree. It's more an aesthetic issue than anything. Among all the complex things that can happen with drought and other stress, it can be something to think about, but I wouldn't be too worried about the woodpecker in your tree.
Great. And I just remembered you were going to share your contact information.
Yeah, if I can do that. There we go.
Russell, while you're still here as a captive audience, I'm going to just share with you a really, if you're based out of Hyde Park, this wonderful video. We had a group of teens last summer who did some videos of different community forests, and one of the most powerful ones was the story of Hyde Park and
Sure.
the trees of Hyde Park. And this is for everyone to enjoy. There were 5 different community stories. You go to this website and just scroll down to Hyde Park. I think it's a 3rd or 4th one here. You might enjoy that.
Okay.
We did our program unfortunately all virtual last year, but we did the best we could with with the situation. Pretty moving stuff that the kids made, especially the Hyde Park one was really powerful.
Yeah.
There's still a handful of people in the presentation.
Can they unmute themselves?
I was just going to suggest that
Are they able to
unmute everybody so you can just ask as you'd like.
There we go. Have a conversation.
Hi, everyone. Happy Arbor Week.
Hey, Sarah.
Happy Arbor Week.
And Olmsted's 199th birthday is today.
That's awesome.
Wow.
So I'm actually going to sign off, but thank you I trust the recording will be available to share, maybe?
That's right.
Thank you. See you all later.
I have to
Bye-bye.
sign off too, but thank you so much. That was great. Thanks.
All right, last call for questions.
I'll just sign off and say thank you so much. I'm the person watering that tree that is possibly an elm.
Oh, good.
I hope
It,
it is.
yeah, very much looks to me as if it's an elm tree. So,
Okay, well, hopefully it will be one of the elms that makes it.
well, if you think it's between an elm and a cherry, one of the things you can do is if you pulled off a small branch from that tree, I take your pruners first before you just start ripping a branch off, but prune a small branch off and scratch that off. And if it smells almost almondy, then that would be a cherry. If it doesn't smell like that, then you would know it would be an elm tree. That almondy smell that you're looking for is actually arsenic that you're smelling. So cherries will produce that. That's one of their natural defense mechanisms that they have. And so if you can kind of smell that, that's how you would know the difference. And that's one of the great identifiers all year round from a cherry from almost any other tree is that arsenic smell.
Is it arsenic or cyanide?
Oh, sorry, cyanide. Sorry.
That's what I thought. Yeah.
Yeah.
The other poison.
The other poison, yeah.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you.
The other way that tells you, look at the very base of a cherry leaf where the petiole meets the leaf, and you'll see these two little nectar buds, especially on a really healthy cherry, that will produce a sort of sticky substance, especially in the spring. And I don't know if this is true, Russell, but I heard that those nectar buds are to actually attract things like ants to protect the tree from other insects.
Yeah, it's funny, a lot of like even peonies where you'll see like the ants like crawl up kind of on the peonies from that. It's something that they don't necessarily like need those to open, but trees are amazing as far as the, coexisting with other animals and what they've done. And, whether it's been produced in order to prevent other insects or it's just, happenstance that's the way it happened to co-evolve. It's hard for us to know
Sure.
Between those two.
Hmm.
Well, thank you so much for sharing
Thank you.
this wealth of knowledge. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their Monday.
Thanks
Bye,
for having
everyone.
me.
Bye, thanks.
See you around, Russell. We'll be in touch.
Okay, thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye, thank you.
Bye-bye.